All right, Larry Krueger here from the Pig and a Pickle Krug Show with a little 49er video. And one of the big debates as the 49ers are getting ready about a month away from going to training camp, the big debate is, are they a complete football team or do they need to add anything to their mix? Well, it's a real interesting question. I think they're a very complete football team. If you look up and down their roster, they've got great depth at quarterback. They've got incredible depth at running back. There's some very good wide receivers that are probably going to wind up cut from this team. They're deep at tight end. They've got a number of options at backup offensive line. And then, the defensive backfield has definitely been replenished with some new bodies. The linebacker core is very, very deep. In fact, there's going to be some really good linebackers who don't make this team. The only spot on the 49ers that in any way could be described as a little thin or a little vulnerable is the defensive line, and more specifically, the defensive end. The Niners made a big signing, adding Javon Hargrave to their defensive line at tackle, and he is going to make a huge impact, you would think. But to afford him, they had to allow their, three of their premier defensive ends to walk away in free agency. So Samson Ebukam left. Charles Omenihu moved on. Jordan Willis moved on. And when those three guys walked out the door, so did roughly 700 snaps of defensive end depth walked out the door as well. And so to me, I think this is an area that they probably need to replenish. And there's a lot of speculation right now that Chase Young could be available. He is the star pass rusher of the Washington Commanders. And if you look at, at the situation, it may not take a lot in draft pick compensation. Maybe as little as one day 2 pick in the 2024 draft to make a deal with the Commanders. Now, the Niners and the Commanders have made deals in the past. They made a trade for Trent Williams just a couple years ago. And Albert Breer is reporting that Washington, who has Martin Mayhew as their general manager, may have kind of a financial crunch on their defensive line with Deron Payne and some of the other players on that line, Jonathan Allen. They've got a lot of really talented defensive linemen that are up for big contracts. And so they're listening to offers, according to Albert Breer. They're not shopping Chase Young. They're certainly not shopping Montez Sweat. But according to reports, they're at least listening to offers for their defensive ends. And I think the 49ers ought to come knocking here. Now, let's talk specifically about Young for a second. He was the first overall pick in the 2020 draft out of Ohio State. Very well coached in college. Great player in college. And he did not disappoint as a rookie. In fact, Chase Young stepped right into the NFL and won the Defensive Rookie of the Year award. He had 42 pressures. He had 7.5 sacks. He was awesome. Absolutely on top of his game, as good as any defensive lineman or defensive end in the sport at that point. But then he played in just 9 games in 2021 before he tore his ACL and has been limited to 3 games last year. If you look at him in the 12 games over the last 2 seasons, Chase Young has only 31 pressures and only 1.5 sacks. And because of the decline in production and the cost of his contract, potentially, Washington opted to decline Chase Young's 5th-year option. So he's a free agent at the end of the year. He only counts $10.9 million against Washington's cap this year. And he would cost the 49ers just $5.3 million against their cap this year. So for the 49ers, I mean, it's very much an inexpensive 1-year flyer on a guy that once upon a time was on top of the sport and as good as any defensive end in the game. And you look at the Niners, they've got Nick Bosa, and Bosa is the best there is. Drake Jackson is a tremendous young talent, but he's in his 2nd year, and there's a lot of unknowns as far as how many games he'll be able to play, what he'll be able to contribute, so on and so forth. He does look a lot better this year, and I would expect Jackson to have a bust-out year, but it's a tall task to ask him to replace Omenihu and Willis and Ebukam all by himself. The Niners did add some veteran depth in Cleveland Farrell and Austin Bryant, but neither of those guys is a big-time guy. Cleveland Farrell has 10 sacks in 4 seasons. Austin Bryant is is kind of blown hot and cold throughout his career. They also have Kerry Hyder, the veteran, who can play inside or outside. Robert Beal, the rookie from Georgia. Alex Barrett, who was a practice squad guy a year ago. They also signed Spencer Wagee as an undrafted free agent, kind of a bigger bodied base defensive end from North Dakota State with a pretty good motor. But this is a spot where, man, you've got Hargrave and Armstead and Nick Bosa. You want to make sure that that fourth guy is a big time player. Otherwise, they're just gonna combo block Bosa on the other side all year long, and he's gonna run into consistent double teams. So you got to have a threat. Now, there are reasons to believe that the price may be right about now. Now, Frank Clark signed with Denver, and if you saw that the details on his contract, he only got $5.5 million guaranteed. So a lot of people were speculating Clark would get 8 to 12 million guaranteed. He got $5.5 million guaranteed. Leonard Floyd is coming off 3 really good years with the Rams the last 3 years. Leonard Floyd signed for a deal with Buffalo, and Leonard Floyd is only getting $7.5 million guaranteed. So it's not like there's huge money being thrown around for these edge rushers, and I think it's reasonable to think the 49ers may be able to get a decent deal on either a free agent if they want to go that route, or it sounds like Chase Young at the price tag that he would be at 5.3 million. And I think Montez Sweat might even be cheaper as far as the contract this year. Those that's very reasonable for what the 49ers budget really is. Now, lucky for the Niners, there's good depth of quality at this position on the market still. Danielle Hunter with Minnesota is widely, there are a lot of rumors out there that he's going to be traded. He's a 28-year-old defensive end who had a 10.5 sack season last year, and he would cost only $5.5 million to the 49ers against the cap if they traded for him. You'd still have to satisfy Minnesota in a trade with draft picks, but $5.5 million is his cap hit this upcoming year if the Niners had Danielle Hunter. And Hunter is very productive. Very, very productive pass rusher. As I said, 10.5 sacks last year. Melvin Ingram, a little long in the tooth, but you could get Ingram for a very cheap amount. He's still a free agent. I believe Jason Pierre-Paul is still out there as a free agent. Yannick Ngakoue, who's been very productive over the last 4 years, very consistent, is only 28. He's a free agent. There's speculation that maybe he'll get $7-8 million max guaranteed. So he's in their price range. And then there's Justin Houston, who's been very productive over the last 3 years. He's an older edge rusher, but Houston's been incredibly productive the last 3 years, and he's available. So the 49ers have some options. Chase Young and Montez Sweat, to me, are the most intriguing because they're younger guys who have a world of ability. Sweat's been very, very consistent since coming out of Mississippi State. There's reason to believe that he could be gotten in a trade. And then Chase Young, if you're getting the Chase Young from Ohio State or the Chase Young from his rookie year, you're adding a significantly dominant player who's only 24, and it's only going to cost you about $5.5 million and maybe a third round pick, maybe a second round pick next year's draft. The other thing from the 49er perspective, they have all their picks next year and 3 or 4 compensatory picks coming back. So they're rich in picks. They're inside their Super Bowl window. It won't cost them a ton of money against the cap to do it. And it just makes a lot of sense. If you add a Montez Sweat or a Chase Young or a Danielle Hunter or a Yannick Ngakoue to what the 49ers have right now on their defensive line, I think you're looking at as good a team as there is. Now, to me, the only downside to the Niners this year, there's really a couple positions where they can't afford injuries. They've got Colton McKivitz at right tackle. They really need him to stay healthy there. Other than that, George Kittle at tight end, the backups are a dramatic step back. They need him to stay healthy. But it's really defensive end opposite Nick Bosa where the 49ers are thin and where there's some unproven talent. And, man, if you could add Chase Young or Montez Sweat or Ngakwe or Justin Houston or Daniil Hunter or really anybody, even Melvin Ingram, Jason Pierre-Paul, if you could add another outside rush guy to what they have, um, I think they're a super they're just that much better of a football team. I mean, right now, you look at that line with Hargrave and Armstead and Bosa. Bosa and Hargrave are probably going to command double teams. But if you have a big time guy like Daniil Hunter or Chase Young or Montez Sweat opposite Nick Bosa, now you really can't double anybody. And I think it just makes the line as a group all that more effective. So the final piece to the puzzle in a lot of ways for the 49ers is the impact defensive end that pass rusher who they can combine with Nick Bosa and wreak havoc on the quarterbacks on their schedule. So to me, that if you look at, if they didn't have the draft picks or they were thin in picks, would be one thing, or if the cost on the cap was going to be exorbitant and it just didn't make sense, that would be another thing. But the reality is I think the cost in draft picks is going to be reasonable. I think the cost on the cap is also reasonable. I think the Niners most definitely are inside their Super Bowl window. And man, you add a Chase Young or a Montez Sweat or Daniil Hunter to what the Niners have, and you're cooking with grease, and you're probably going to be the overwhelming favorite to go to the Super Bowl out of the NFC. And this could be the final piece to the puzzle, especially with the Niners adding so much on the back end and adding Steve Wilks. You've got a ton of speed and depth at linebacker. You've added some good young players this offseason, and you've got some phenomenal ascending young talent in your secondary. You add one more big-time rusher to this defensive line, and the 49ers are going to be scary good. All right, thanks to Pig and a Pickle for being the proud sponsor of the Krug Show. Check them out in Emeryville and Corte Madera. And thanks to all of you for supporting the Krug Show on YouTube.